How's it going, everybody? My name is fallinghurts, and you know how it goes. I usually want to talk about a game when I start a video. So today we're going to be talking about a game that I have been reviewing, or playing to review, and that is Deathbound. And the best way to explain it is probably perfectly said on the Steam page itself. Deathbound is a one-of-a-kind, party-based Souls-like set in a callous world where faith and science clash, where you can dynamically transform between fallen warriors, all with their own unique skill sets, combat styles, and rich history. Conquer a brutal reality where life and death were never more conflicted. So off the bat, as far as marketing goes, I think this is very accurate. As for your other need-to-knows with Deathbound, the game is $30 US, and it's coming from Trial Forge Studio and published by Tate Multimedia. I don't think Andrew Tate, but that wouldn't be a good sign either, so, it is what it is. So without skipping a beat, I want to say that I do have issues with this game, and while I don't think there's very much that I would consider major, it's enough small things that kind of adds up to, at times, an annoying experience. But at the same time, there was times where I was genuinely having a blast playing this game. So let's set the stage. So there's a few different characters you can play as, some in the Army of Death, who to some unwitting end will attempt to appease their goddess. And then on the other hand, you have some other characters, some that are just outcasts, thieves, and then others on the other side, the more scientific side of life itself. And the main gameplay loop of this game is quite simple. I mean, it's very much Souls-like in its level design and the way its combat actually works, but as opposed to having different character builds, putting points into certain attributes which can make you use different types of weapons, whether it be magic or dexterity or strength builds in, say, Elden Ring. In this game, if you want to attack in a different way, you can very quickly switch from, say, I don't know, the guy with the long sword or the guy that shoots out magic that does poison damage. And in that way, it's almost kind of satisfying that you can get the best of both worlds a lot of the time. And at max, you can have up to 4 of those types of characters on standby. And while recording this, I can't remember if it was 6 or 8 off the top of my head that you have access to. But you can choose between those loadouts, and what's really interesting is that due to the fact that you're all living in one body, you're kind of like an unholy mass of things that won't die. You keep assimilating all of these different characters into your body. And what I really like is both from a story dynamic and also a gameplay mechanic that these characters can have both pros and cons against one another. They have what they call conflicts with one another. So for instance, say you've got a really devout death soldier, and then you've got a really prolific life scientist, to put it simply. They're going to conflict because they have 2 very different belief systems and skill sets, and what that basically comes down to from a gameplay mechanic is some debuffs, or if they actually work together for some instances, you get some buffs as well. It's never so bad that it's like completely game-changing, but it can definitely turn the tide of combat. Say you really only use the Death Knight, that's the one you've put all your points, your upgrade points into. Then you want to make sure that he's as least limited as absolutely possible. And the reason I keep harping on him is because he absolutely is my favorite character in this game. I feel like his struggle and confliction is the best. And while we're talking about the fact that you can switch characters, I've already mentioned that some of these characters have reasons to hate one another, and I don't think they ever play it up enough to where it's like truly emotional and impactful, but there's a few moments, a little bit later in the game, probably about midway through, I won't spoil anything, that I do think it does a really good job of like setting up stakes for these characters, like even in death, like, hey, I really don't fucking like this person that we just absorbed, or hey, I really don't like this that we're doing. And sometimes you have to do it because that's how you have to continue on. And in that way, I think the story could have done a little bit better, but I really liked where they were going with it. Another thing I really liked, and this is just an early example, so I'll kind of explain it. You see a couple soldiers who are basically working themselves to death based off of orders that said they were expendable. You, as a commander, were basically like, hey, okay, well, you can finish up what you're doing here, and then instead of working here until you die by some random sword or whatever, you can go to the front lines with the rest of them, and you can actually be fine. You don't have to desert. Well, lo and behold, hours later, you get to a point where they actually would have been, and then you find a ring. And it's little stuff like that it's very Souls-like in some of its storytelling and things like that. And I also like that there is some choice to the game as well. There are multiple endings, as per usual with a Souls-like and that kind of experience. And it takes a little bit to get into where that story is going, but I feel like the actual upfront dialogue of this game does reveal quite a bit about the plot itself, and I have to commend that because in my humble opinion, Dark Souls, Bloodborne was a little better off in my opinion, and Elden Ring all do a terrible job of a story and a story setup. But that's just me. The final thing that I wanted to make note of that I really liked about the game was the fact that sometimes when you're talking to certain characters or doing certain actions, you need to switch from one character to the other. For instance, if you're talking to, I don't know, a life scientist, you're going to be one of those affiliated with that type of reasoning and that alliance. But okay, and don't get me wrong, I'm not done praising this game, but now's the part where I can finally talk about some criticisms as we get into more of the nitty-gritty of the gameplay itself, and just kind of the minute-to-minute. I like the overall broad strokes of this game. Sometimes it's just the execution that I'm not the biggest fan of. But as we transition into the gameplay, I guess I'll tackle the technical stuff first. The one thing that's less about my opinion and more about just how it goes. For the first, 4 or 5 hours or so, I played the game on my computer. I think it ran really well. I had next to no hiccups, but I did have one crash. So not terrible, not great either, I guess, in that sense, because you don't really want crashes, but it was in a fine spot, didn't really annoy me too much. Now, after about 5 hours of gameplay, I figured that was plenty of footage for the review. I did switch over to my Steam Deck, seeing as how the game was meant to be Steam Deck playable. Not verified, but playable. And I have to say that yes, it is playable. There's some settings that need to be dropped down to get a proper performance that you want from this type of game. But it did run fine. It ran well enough. There was only 1 or 2 spots that on my Steam Deck did have some dips that my PC obviously did not. Overall, though, I think I would recommend playing the game on a actual system if you could. You know, the Steam Deck is a nice way to play it. The smaller screen with the lower resolution kind of cancels out, but not entirely. But hey, that is what it is. But okay, things that I did not like. Let's go ahead and start with the presentation. I like a lot of the, memories you find around the world to set up some of these characters and to learn more about their backstories. You can only access these certain points if you have the right character, just like I mentioned earlier. But what I don't like sometimes is the voice acting. There's some characters that you can tell did a really good job, and then there's some characters that, they sound like caricature versions of, let's say they went to do a casting call for medieval thief, let's say, and somebody just gave it their all, but they went in the completely wrong direction. And I know that might be, again, a minor nitpick, but this was one of those ones that it was so heavy throughout the course of the game that whenever it did show up, or whenever some of these voices did show up, it was just so frustrating. And another thing that's in this game that is not in those other Souls-like games is you cannot skip dialogue in this game, which was a bit of an annoyance. I'm not the type of person that skips dialogue, generally speaking, but when those voices popped up, I was reading way faster than they were talking. So I was trying to get through them, and I couldn't. But speaking of things that aren't in this game, that are in others, one thing that you can't do in this game is multi-use items. So for instance, there's things in this game that give you your equivalent of souls. And I know, while that wasn't in Dark Souls 1, it was put into the Dark Souls Remaster. Because that is just something that is quality of life that has improved the genre over time. It is not in Deathbound. I think that could be an easy fix, and I can see with my clairvoyance right now that the justification is that, well, it also heals you, so it's important to only use one at a time because you can actually use them during combat. However, that's silly because most of the time that I actually used them was right next to my essential bonfire as I was about to level up, and it took way longer than it ever needed to. Sticking with gameplay itself, though, another thing that I had an issue with was sometimes locking on and lock-on cameras. There's this really weird tendency for the switching back and forth to not work properly if when initially you locked onto something, it was the only one in range. So for my testing, the way it makes sense is that, say you lock onto someone and you use the stick to switch which one you're targeting at the time. That works. However, if you lock onto something and it's the only one in view at the time, or the only one in shot, then you move in and there's more that come around the corner, per se. For whatever reason, I had a hard time ever getting that to actually work on those ones that were out of range initially. So maybe they don't register as something I can switch to unless I obviously stop targeting and retarget. But in the heat of combat, when I'm switching from one character to the next and I'm kind of stupid in the earlier hours, that really threw me off. The one thing that gets me about this is it wasn't exactly a 100% thing. It didn't happen all the time, but it happened frequently enough that I started to notice exactly what was going on. Now, as for the actual combat itself, I didn't mind it. there was a lot I liked. Like I said, switching from one character to the other and having basically 4 play styles at once feels very good. As you do damage, you do build up a meter that allows you to do special attacks as you switch from one character to the next. If you complete the meter fully, you do one really big attack at the end. And I like this system a lot. I mean, it really keeps you on your toes during the combat, makes you want to strive for something else. And that, outside of the other conflicts that I mentioned earlier with the characters, the only other thing you really need to know about the combat itself, other than knowing that, hey, you can have a character with spears or crossbow and little daggers and stuff like that, is that there tends to be always a good character for the job. And I do like that. That feels pretty good. It's very satisfying. However, sometimes you'll notice that you don't have the right character at the right time, as you can have more than just 4, but that's okay because there's never anything that you can't do. It just makes things harder at times. It's one of those learn and adapt scenarios. One thing I did think was a bit bizarre was actually the way you heal within the game. So essentially you have what is called essence, which is your life force, and as you heal one of your 4 characters, it takes away from the health of the other 3. And again, as I mentioned earlier, with the item that gives you souls, like the greater souls from the Dark Souls series, one proper use of that is that it will heal one character without taking away from the others, which is a huge benefit. I understand what the use is within the combat of the game. However, most of the times I was actually using those and remembered to use them, I was right by my respective bonfire. Now, sticking with the gameplay, the last 2 things I really wanted to talk about were the enemies and the pacing. So I think the enemies and the boss fights are pretty well done. The first boss fight of the game was genuinely very, very good. And there's a few others that tend to stand out a bit. Enemy design does get a little boring, for a little bit, but that's okay. It ramps up again in a really interesting way, and the way that the world building and lore kind of leads into some of that stuff is really, really promising. And you'll learn that the story and the world building was actually one of the stronger aspects of this game. It was more of the small pricks of the gameplay that really kind of soured me a bit. But now discussing on pacing, each character, when you meet them, has this lengthy little introduction that you kind of learn the essential bits of their backstory, kind of the, the flash in the pan, what kind of character they are. Are they heartless? Are they full of life? Have they been wronged by society? Everything. Sometimes it just gets a little bit too much. It's not super interactive. You get a short combat tutorial for each of them. It's just boring. I don't know how else to say it. I don't think it was done well. But at the same time, without forcing me to look at each of these characters individually, I don't know exactly what you could have done to make me care about any of them. But outside of, story pacing, the actual level design itself is pretty good. There are shortcuts that you can unlock, and there are plenty of ways to interact with the world, and a lot of the enemy encounters are set up in such a way that it can be challenging, whether it be ambushes or larger numbers, smaller hallways, things like that. All of this is done in a way that it really ramps up the player knowledge before it throws anything at them that they, can't handle, per se. So in that way, I don't think the game is too hardcore in a bad way, and I think it's fairly player-friendly in that regard. But the one thing that really got me with the combat and balancing that I think is going to be my final main point of this video, the things that I didn't like, was that as you lose health, you also lose stamina. So your max stamina isn't something that you can put points into and just have more of. There is an upgrade system that lets you get more health and more stamina, and more individual perks of each character. You can build them up, kind of your perfect squad if that's what you choose, and that's fine. That works well. But what I mean is that as you lose health with each individual character, their max stamina goes down. So it's a weird system overall, and I can say I don't like it. I just don't like the fact that, it seems that as you lose health, so as you're failing to not get hit, you're now also being double punished by having less stamina. You would think actually that you would get more stamina to kind of counteract this. Maybe that's just me. In my opinion, I wouldn't have stamina based off of health at all, but it's obviously balanced that way for a reason. The game could fall apart without it, but I just didn't like that system overall. I felt it very limiting. But at the same time, the fact that you do have 4 characters to switch between means that, hey, you can get the job done one way or the other. You don't have to stay on one character. You can switch to any of them. However, I just personally wasn't the biggest fan. Oh, and another thing. The UI for this game, I hate the color scheme. I like that nice teal blue across dark backgrounds. That looks great. And it's really flashy, it's really cool. But when it was decided that teal, gray, and red would be the 3 colors to, kind of indicate anything on my screen at any one time at a quick glance while I'm maybe in the middle of combat. I'm sorry, I'm not colorblind. I feel like we could have probably used more vibrant colors if that's how you were going to set up the bars. Because the fact that it's all contained within one little triangle or square, whatever you want to say, I failed my shapes. It really just makes me yearn for regular bars at the top of the screen. And it's small little things like this that really add up to something that's like, man, it's so close to being a really, really great experience that in my opinion, it's just not. But most of these things are not major. And even to kind of end, I think the level designs of some of these locations are incredible. I think, the places it sends you, and like whether it be in the cityscape or otherwise, I think this game does an incredible job of looking really, really cool. It's just in those moments where you feel like you might have a power fantasy, or you do have a power fantasy, that it just doesn't look or feel as cool to play in those moments. So with that being said, that's been my review of Deathbound. It's alright. I don't love it. I don't hate it either, actually. But I probably wouldn't buy this game full price. I would probably pick it up on sale at some point. How much you value what I've had to say would probably base it off of how much. If you're just like, this crazy fucking Coleman guy, you could get it 10% off. You could get it more. It just depends. But whatever you do, I hope you enjoy the game. And developers, if you see this, I didn't hate your game. I actually enjoyed playing it. And I'm sorry it took me this long to get a review out. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.